And LBC doesn't just stand for London's Biggest Conversation, it stands for the LBC Book Club, which I've just realised I hadn't sort of thought of that before. Anyway, it's the LBC Book Club, which we do every Monday night. Tonight, joining me in the studio are Steve Richards, who's written a book, a very handsomely sized paperback called Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour. It's published by Fourth Estate and it costs $14.99, which you might think is quite a lot for a paperback, but it's effectively a hardback with a paperback cover. So very good value. The Story of Britain is a beautifully produced book. It's published by Walker Books and it's by Patrick Dillon and it's got wonderful illustrations in it. And, I mean, obviously it does what it says on the tin. It is the story of Britain. And I was looking at it earlier and I wondered exactly who it was aimed at. And I reckoned that it ought to be aimed at adults who don't know an awful lot about history, Patrick, as well as children, because it really does cover everything, not in huge length, but you don't want that if you're trying to get into the subject, do you?
Well, no, and very much the idea behind it was to get the whole story, all the sweep of the story of Britain, into one volume. And for that reason, it's small, it's broken into very easy chunks for children. And though it was certainly aimed at children, I started writing it from telling stories to my own children. I've always told my kids stories, and in time, as we started to visit historic sites like the Tower of London or whatever, they would ask me what had happened there, and I'd start to tell stories about history. And over time, I started to think that I could fit them together into a narrative history of Britain and realised that there was nothing else that really did that told the story of Britain as a story. But having done it, I've had, and it's been fantastic to have it, plenty of grown-ups coming to me and saying that they'd forgotten all the history they ever learnt at school and that this has been a great way for them to get back into it.
We'll come on to the whole subject of history and particularly teaching at school a bit later, because I know you've got some strong views on that. Steve Richards, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Now, there have been a lot of books about Gordon Brown out recently and the whole history of New Labour. And we'll come on to the main subject of your book in a minute, but there's obviously been a bit of news today about what's happening in the Labour Party. Ed Miliband has appointed a new spin doctor. I'm not sure what his official title is, but Tom Baldwin, who writes for The Times, and it has to be said a fairly controversial character in the parliamentary lobby. What's been the reaction to that appointment today?
A lot of surprise, but I think apart from the most obvious sort of appointment when Tony Blair appointed Alistair Campbell, when everybody knew that was going to happen, there's always surprise about these appointments in the sense that the brief is such a weird one, I think, to go and spin on behalf of a politician. And it's always aimed at journalists, some of whom are having a pretty good time of it in the media. And so I think it's always quite surprising when you see who goes for it. He is a controversial figure. He will be absolutely committed. And clearly Ed Miliband needed somebody. I mean, it is in opposition, all you've got is words and images in the media. You can't be proven by policy. Only governments can be tested by policy. And so it's absolutely essential that you have a media team in place. Now, whether he'll be any good, I've no idea. You can never tell in advance. These appointments rarely work. Sometimes they do. It depends on a whole combination of things, most importantly of all, whether the leader's any good. But it was absolutely essential that he filled that gap. He's almost left it too late already in some respects.
But for someone who was seen by many observers as Alistair Campbell's mouthpiece in the lobby, I mean, a lot of the stories that he wrote you knew had come directly from Alistair Campbell. And he's quite a bruiser of a character too. Could Ed Miliband not have found somebody maybe like yourself,
if
more
he,
urbane character?
Well, yeah. As I say, you know, the problem is with these jobs, most journalists don't want to do them, frankly. But I think that it might work with him. I mean, I think it's unfair, this mouthpiece thing. I mean, I can tell lots of political editors at the moment who are being fed stories by the Tory government. I never hear them being accused of being conduits. It happens all the time. And he is much more than that, actually. He was a very formidable journalist. He's been in Washington. He was very good friends with Alistair Campbell, but in opposition, Alistair Campbell was a really effective press secretary for Tony Blair.
Oh, no,
in
absolutely.
government, there were problems, but in opposition, Blair used to say, when I bumped into Blair, say, Alistair, Steve, he's a genius. He's an absolute genius. He can just read the rhythms of news. Now, if Tom Baldwin can do that, Ed Miliband will welcome him. But none of us know whether it will be a success or failure at this point.
Well, as you've just heard, Steve is an accomplished mimic of various politicians. Have you got an Ed Miliband ready yet?
Not yet, but there's almost there. I've got to work on it, but there's the nasal,
there's a slight
thing.
sort of, there's something going on there.
There's something going on, and it will come. It will come.
Patrick Dillon, author of The Story of Britain, do you follow politics an awful lot?
Yes, very much so.
Thank God for that.
And I think what's fantastic about when one's in a state of actual real-time politics happening at a moment like this, which is incredibly interesting politically. The last 6 months have been so fast moving. There's every chance that the next few years will be the same. And it's a real education for anybody who writes about history that this is what it feels like when it's happening. And so you go back to the kind of early days before the Civil War when both sides were desperately trying to get their story out there in just the same way that politicians do now. And the conversations were the same. It's how do you get your story out? How do you make sure that the King's message gets out rather than Parliament's, or the other way round? Not employing spin doctors, but doing exactly the same kind of processes and with the same kind of uncertainties.
So spin was happening even in those medieval times?
I think spin, in the sense of wanting to put across your version of events, your narrative of why things are happening and how they got there and what's going to happen next, is something that all politicians at all times, all kings, all bishops, all popes, have always wanted to do. In the story of Henry II and Becket, both men were trying to put across their version of events, the king's version that the church was too powerful, or the church's version that the king was trying to take over. So spin doctors, no, it's become more and more sophisticated and morphed to suit the media we have now. But the idea of selling your story has always been the heart of politics.
And in a sense, that's personified on virtually every page of your book, Steve Richards, isn't it? There's sort of the attempt by the two main characters in New Labour, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, to get the upper hand, not just in spin, but in power, within government.
The way Gordon Brown went about winning an argument, I think, is very interesting, and for a time was really effective. Which is that he worked on the assumption that England was basically a centre-right country, and therefore he needed to find a way of making acceptable increases in public spending and quite a few tax increases. And what he did is instead of making the argument in advance that is what he was going to do, he adopted a public narrative which was all about prudence with a purpose, Britishness, consensus and all the rest of it. But underneath, he did do some big increases in public spending, and as we know, he became famous for stealthily putting up taxes, which, if you think about it, is a contradiction in terms. And then, until when he peaked, which I think was around 2002, once he had done these things, they proved to be very popular. Actually, people forget that he himself and his policies were incredibly popular for a long period of time. Then he put the arguments retrospectively about public spending and saying, look, these Tories will cut what we've done. But it was a very, very interesting way to sort of approach an argument. It was very defensive. And Ed Miliband has decided he can't do it. That particular card has been played. Tony Blair did things a little differently. I mean, he was further to the right than Brown, therefore he could find common ground more easily with the Sun and the Daily Mail. Not the Daily Mail, actually, they hated him. But he had a more sort of, kind of sprinkle the bullets around a bit effect, so the Sun were kept happy with one story and all the rest of it and something else. But they had different approaches, but they were both rightly obsessed with the media. And I say rightly because it is incredibly powerful in Britain, in its various forms. The internet, with things like your website and others, Twitter now, and indeed still, in my view, newspapers. I think they're all still very, very important.
And long may it remain so.
Yeah.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Iain Dale, and I've got Steve Richards, Chief Political Commentator at The Independent, with me, and author of Whatever It Takes, and Patrick Dillon, the author of Story of Britain. And if you've got any questions that you'd like to put to either of them, if they spark something off in your mind during our conversation, do give us a call on 0845 6060 973. You can text us on 84850, or tweet me at LBC973, or email Iain, I-A-I-N, at lbc.co.uk. The time now is 9:15. Time for travel with... It's the LBC Book Club with me, Iain Dale. Steve Richards is with me, author of Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour, and Patrick Dillon is also here, the author of The Story of Britain. And the subtitle is an interesting one. It's a very long subtitle, which is really the history of two islands, Britain and Ireland, and of all the people, Scottish, Irish, Welsh and English, who've lived in them. So you've set yourself up there for a big book, really, haven't you?
Well, it's a big subject, yeah. It's a big subject, and a big subject to cram into the space of only just over 300 pages, including illustrations. But it seemed to be really important to get it into that quite small volume. It would be easy to tell the story with unlimited space. I think the real challenge for me, and the challenge that I think children want, is a story that in quite a small compass can take them from 1066 all the way through up to now, just through stories and without spreading it out too wide.
And how important are all the illustrations? Because, I mean, it's littered with them. And, I mean, speaking with my publisher's hat on now, that's a publisher's nightmare, and particularly when most of them are in colour.
Well, I think it's great to have illustrations. Generally, I think parents with younger children would rather like to have more. We talked earlier about how grown-ups were reading the book a bit and using it as a way of getting back into history. They probably need the illustrations a bit less. But they're a nice way to punctuate it.
I'm just looking at the pictures of William and Mary, who absolutely facially look identical.
Well, it was unfortunate. There was a whole period of British history when everybody wore wigs, and
yes.
the men therefore become identical. And
I think that should come back, you know.
Well, perhaps.
I think many of my colleagues on LBC could do with wearing wigs, including me sitting here now, I think. But
well, it would change Parliament as well if all of our politicians had long periwigs.
Yes, they look rather more glamorous than they do at the moment.
Was this a difficult book to get published? Because I can imagine that a publisher would need to have a bit of foresight with a book like this. It's not something that, if someone came to me as a publisher with this proposal, I'd probably need a bit of convincing.
No, it was easy to find a publisher, I suppose, because there's really nothing quite like it. There's Our Island Story, which now goes back getting on 100 years. It's a very different book for a very different kind, and nobody, I think, has really replaced it, and it was that gap that I really wanted to fill, to write a new story for Britain now, but that had the same kind of fun and energy that went into Our Island Story. So there was a big gap. Walker Books jumped at it and were really enthusiastic about it from the start. But it was certainly quite a hard book to get right. I've written history for adults before. Writing for children is very much harder because, you know, when you're writing history for adults, if the worst comes to the worst, you can always be very slightly boring. When you're writing for children, you simply can't, you know, and you know they'll turn away as soon as you've lost them, as soon as the characters aren't there, the stories, the events flowing one after the other.
And do you have to sort of market test this on children at all?
Very much. Well, as I was writing it, my children are of that kind of age, the age that the book, particularly when I started writing it 4 years ago, the age the book's aimed at. So I would tell them stories, and I think every story in the book I can hear in my head telling them that story. We used to go for holidays in France, and on long walks through the woods I'd tell them stories which, to start with, were just the sort of stories that we all tell our children, but after a while became stories about history. And so I think I didn't know about writing for children, because I hadn't done that before, but I did know about telling stories to children, and it was finding a way of putting that down on the page that was the real challenge of the book.
Now, it's titled The Story of Britain, but Britain, of course, has a lot of different identities, doesn't it? It's not that you can't say the British are a sort of homogenous race.
No, and one of the real fascinations for me in writing the book now is that I've written it at a time, and I think this is why there aren't many books like this out there, when the question about who we are and what Britain is has really come to the forefront. And one can think of all sorts of reasons for that. The fact that Britain really was born as an idea, as a word, with the start of our empire, and with the end of the empire, which in some ways was delayed until 1989 by the Cold War following immediately after the end of empire. All of that's been opened up again, and therefore the whole question of how Scotland and Wales relate to England within this thing that we call Britain. And of course social change has happened at the same time, and immigration has changed the face of Britain very much, and mass markets, global communications has all made us live a much less insular life than we ever did before. So all of these things are challenging, I think, the sense of what Britain is and what we feel when we hear the word Britain.
And of course, Steve Richards' identity, British identity, plays a role in politics nowadays, which it didn't 10 or 15 years ago, really, did it?
Well, I think in what sense do you think it's changed?
Well, I just think with devolution, I think there is much more of a sense of Scottishness in Scotland, Welshness in Wales, and I think the English are beginning to feel more English than maybe they used to 15 or 20 years ago.
I think that's the missing link. I agree with you completely about Scotland and Wales, although I think it was always there in Scotland and Wales. They now have a political body that represents it as well. England is strange in that respect. I don't detect, actually. I remember a good friend of ours, David Davis, a Conservative MP, saying quite a few years ago to me, he detected the drumbeat of English nationalism. Well, I don't hear that beat very loudly.
I do.
Do you?
I absolutely do. I think that over the next, maybe not yet, but in the next 10, 20 years, I think you're going to hear it a lot more, particularly as the English feel that they're being treated very unfairly, sending all this money up to Scotland and Wales, and I mean, you can permeate the figures however you like, but English taxpayers are now going to fund Welsh students.
Yeah,
and eventually people will see that as an unfairness.
Yeah, I think they already do, but it's much harder to protest. You see, when you've got such easy objects to protest against at the moment, like the increase in top-up fees, say, or whatever comes next in terms of protests, the focus tends to be on the government. I can't, for example, imagine a demo in London against Scotland. It doesn't quite work.
I think there are good reasons, though, because Britain's never been an equal partnership of 3 or 4 nations. Britain was always England's project, to which Scotland and Wales were more or less coerced. Sometimes willingly, some people much less willingly. But England's always been by far the biggest, by far the most powerful partner, and going all the way back to our medieval history, it was England that created the notion of a hegemony over Wales and Scotland. So it's not surprising if we have a rather different attitude towards Britain and the decay of Britain as an idea, or the challenge to Britain as an idea, than people in Wales and Scotland do.
When you're writing a book like this, The Story of Britain, how balanced do you have to be? Because you will have your own views as to what a particular period of history meant. And yet, because it is aimed predominantly at children, presumably you have to be more balanced than you might be if you were Simon Sharma or David Starkey.
I think
doesn't that lead to a bit of blandness in a book like this?
I think it's important to be balanced. I mean, clearly one could go out and write a left-wing history of Britain, or clearly one could go out and write a right-wing history of Britain, and each would please half of the population. I think, particularly writing for children, it's incredibly important to be more consensual. I think if one's writing a book, part of whose purpose is to go back and rediscover what Britain is, who we are, is there real meaning in Britain now and for the future? And my conclusion in using this as an exercise for myself in going back through our history was that there were very strong strands of unity, themes, overriding themes that have run through all of our history in all of the nations of Britain, around which a great consensus can still be found. Themes of freedom that go back, of course, to Magna Carta, to Simon de Montfort, to the Civil Wars and so on. Themes of toleration that scarred all of our history throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. These are very strong, these are very strong ideas, and they're very deeply rooted in the story that we all share. And you can go a long way to the right or to the left before you lose that common sense of purpose and that common sense of interest. So I think I found consensus quite easy to find. I didn't find myself suppressing stories.
And how do you deal with rather difficult issues, emotive issues, like the British relationship with Ireland or slavery?
Well, I think it was certainly important to me that those stories, which weren't really there in my history education. I didn't learn much about slavery, plenty about William Wilberforce and the end of it, but not about how or why it started. And I don't think that I learned anything about Ireland. I think for 2 reasons it was really important to me not to try and suppress those stories, if you like. Partly because the world we live in now, and we saw it with the whole political scandals of the last 18 months or so, requires openness. We know when we're being shortchanged. We know when those are in authority, whether those who are writing a book or people who are running the country, are not telling us the truth or are withholding things. We're very wise to that, and we expect to be treated with the respect that gives us information. And the other and perhaps stronger reason is really to trust young people with information like that. When they're reading Harry Potter or Philip Pullman, they're used now to the idea that the goodies aren't all angels and the baddies don't all wear black cloaks. They're used to emotional and moral complexity, that good people sometimes do bad things and bad people sometimes do good things, and you can't always be sure which is which. And so I think that absolutely one can trust young readers to have the sophistication to read complex stories about things that we've done wrong in the past and understand them.
I've just thought who you remind me of. You have a look-alike at LBC. You look very much like Iain Payne, the sports presenter who's on Saturday afternoons.
I'll assume that's a good thing.
That's a very good thing. You sound nothing like him, though, I have to tell you. You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Iain Dale, Steve Richards and also Patrick Dillon. If you have a question for them, 0845 6060 973.
84850 Iain Dale.
You're listening to the LBC Book Club with me, Iain Dale. Steve Richards is with me. He's the author of Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour. And Patrick Dillon's here too. He's the author of The Story of Britain, which is a fantastic book, primarily aimed at children, but I think actually very good for adults who think that they've been shortchanged in their history education as well. We'll be coming back to them in just a second. But first, we're going to find out what Clive Bull has on his programme from 10 o'clock. Hello, Clive.
Hi, Ian. Yes, I'll be here at 10, and we're going to talk about... well, actually, first of all, it's the dreaded C word, cuts. Sorry. We don't like to do it every night, but we're going to talk about cuts, particularly council cuts, after the figures have emerged, just what kind of cuts councils in England are to face. And I want to ask the question, what is there that could be cut, and what is there that you would really miss if it was cut? They're really saying nothing is off limits, even your local library, your park, your leisure centre. So we'll find out where there should be cuts and where there won't be or shouldn't be. We'll also talk about the suspected suicide bomber, the Swedish bomber, and his other life in Luton. And we've been hearing today from the chairman of the mosque that he stormed out of after revealing his radical feelings. And this chairman said, well, it's up to the police to spot potential terrorists, so...
No, actually, it's up to everybody.
Really. Is it up to just the police? I mean, I was a bit surprised that he said that. And what can we be doing to spot potential terrorists? Is it our job? And also, long-term forecasters, not that long-term now, actually, are saying a white Christmas is almost inevitable.
Really?
Yeah.
I'm terribly excited by that news.
That gets two reactions. And I want to know which one yours is. Good or bad?
Do you know, I'm 48 and I can only remember, I think, one white Christmas in my lifetime. Steve Richards.
Yeah, well, I'm about your age as well, and I can't remember one.
No.
I can't remember snow on Christmas Day. I don't know whether to be thrilled at the prospect or think, what a pain to get around.
I know.
You don't want to get around.
I just can't work out whether to be happy or miserable at that news.
Christmas Day in front of the fire, looking out on the snow.
This is going to be a divisive topic, obviously.
Well, you can tell.
I think it's going to split the
Clive,
listeners.
your switchboard will be lighting up.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Clive. Right, let's get back to the LBC Book Club. Just to remind you the books that we're talking about tonight. The Story of Britain by Patrick Dillon, and also Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour. Right, Steve Richards, let's turn to you. And just to remind you, if you want to phone in, if you want to ask Steve Richards a question about Gordon Brown's political career, how he met his end, his battles with Tony Blair, the number to call is 0845 6060 973. And of course, Steve, you've really chronicled the whole of that period, haven't you, as a newspaper columnist?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's what was strange for me and quite fortuitous is that I was, as you are now, a broadcaster, but switched to writing columns, which I always think is one of the great joys of political journalism, in about 1995, 1996, just as the New Labour project was taking off. So inevitably, I got to know them well in opposition and followed it all the way through. I can see some young people doing that with the coalition now, although I still regard myself as young. I hate
and so
to
do
add. So yeah, I did get to know them well. And what I thought by the end, and that's why I decided to write through the prism of Brown rather than Blair, is that a heck of a lot of books had come out which basically said Blair was a great reforming, crusading Prime Minister, but if it wasn't an overwhelming success, it was because of that maniac next door who was anti-reform. And I knew it was much more complicated than that in some ways Brown was a reformer too, but in different ways to Blair, but he had a clearer sense of where he wanted to go at times, especially, I think, in the second term, where there were flaming disputes over policy as well as ambition. And the Chronicle, really, up until, I think, this book, has been very much to do with ambition. Brown wanted the crown, the great Shakespearean battle. But there were really interesting debates about policy, rows about policy, which incidentally continue now in the coalition. Because one of the big things that they used to row about, Blair and Brown, is the thing that the coalition are now trying to deal with, which is they want to give power away to local hospitals, local schools. They want to encourage innovation at a local level. But all the money is being raised centrally through tax. And so Brown would say to Blair, you want to allow hospitals to go bankrupt. I've just put my neck on the line putting up a tax to pay for the NHS. Do you think I'm going to sit there and allow hospitals to go bust? The same conversations are going on within the coalition now about localism and all these other things. So there are sort of echoes and lessons, I think, for today. But also, I think what I try to do is say, look, there's been one side of this story. There are two sides to it, and it's a really interesting and rich mix of personality and ideological conflict, which is still burning away now. That's what I try to do.
And how much of Gordon Brown's failure, and I do think that you have to say that his premiership was overall a failure, how much of that was due to his personality?
I agree with you. The book, of course, goes back to 1992, and I argue in the book that between 1992 and about 2002, he was the titanic figure in British politics. After that, I think the ambition ate away at him. And by the time he got it, it was too late. He was exhausted. He had run out of ideas. And the inheritance was much thornier than it looked at the time, which was he couldn't work out whether to personify change or that he was actually to reassure everyone that he was like Blair too, and he couldn't decide which way to move. So those were the main things. The personality was then a sort of potent additional ingredient, but it was the same personality who was pretty successful for the first few years, so I think it was the other factors as well that came in. I think by the time he got it, he was doomed. Even if the non-election hadn't happened, which was as catastrophic, his decision not to call an early election, and as traumatic for him as Tony Blair getting the leadership in 1994, I think by the time he got it, in a very sort of Shakespearean way, he was doomed.
Do you think he's an almost semi-tragic figure?
Yeah, I do. Certainly for now, in the sense that I think, it was destined to end bleakly. But I think over time history will be more generous to him than current fashion allows. I noticed the reviews of his book. There have been some snide ones, but there have been some rave reviews in the Anatole Koletsky in the Times, in the Financial Times. There was a very positive review. In America, he's getting glowing reviews about what he did during the financial crisis. And so I think there will be a change, probably more quickly than some former prime ministers.
I think that's quite interesting because a book that I've published, which I won't mention the name of so I can't be accused of promoting it, but that one of the key conclusions of that was that certainly the middle chapters are all about Brown and the financial crisis. And it is quite clear that he played an absolutely pivotal role in what the international community did, and the international leaders really looked up to him during that period.
Yeah, I think it was an epic contribution. And in one of the reviews of the Gordon Brown book, Robert Skidelsky, the economist, points out that he was operating at a time where there was an interregnum in the United States, because Obama hadn't quite taken over when this had started. In Europe, there was sort of a kind of defensive neurosis. Germany, what do we do? We're not used to this. France, similarly. And he went round the capitals of all these countries and galvanise them into action. And he did it for all kinds of reasons, but one of them was conviction. He was absolutely sure that there had to be a sort of global and coordinated response to what he regarded as an event that was as potentially catastrophic as the Wall Street crash in 1929. And it was big politics, and it's extraordinary when you think about it that as he was doing this, some very puny figures in the Labour Party were trying to remove him.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to sort of see anyone else who could have risen to that particular crisis at the time, including David Miliband. I think they would have been scared to the point of paralysis if anyone else had taken over. So there are sort of, positive things, but I think at the moment there is a sort of tragic dimension to his political career.
Patrick Dillon, I'm going to put you on the spot now. Can you think of a historical figure that Gordon Brown might resemble, or the relationship that Brown had with Blair? Or is that
it's slightly too early to say, isn't it? Because I mean, Steve's writing about Gordon Brown at this fascinating moment when he's escaped the clutches of journalists but hasn't yet been grasped by the historians.
That's a very good way of putting it.
And so it's too early to tell, because it's a cliche that history is written by the victors. And we don't yet know...
It was written by Churchill. He wrote his own history, didn't he?
And therefore created it to some extent. Yeah.
And we don't yet know who the victors are. I mean, one could imagine, looking towards the end of this Parliament, one could think of two perfectly plausible scenarios. One where the economy recovers, David Cameron and George Osborne are given credit for it, they win their own mandate at the next election, the Labour Party turns back to the left, but Cameron is there for a long period. His version of conservatism appears to be successful. And from that viewpoint, in 10 years' time, the first 20 years' time, the first historians will be saying that New Labour was a strange aberration for a fundamentally left-wing party. Or you could imagine it all going horribly wrong economically. Miliband keeps the Labour Party to the centre, they come back at the next election, and the New Labour project continues. And in that case, history will be written by the New Labour victors, and Gordon Brown will be seen as one of the architects of it, rather than as a tragic figure. So there are two quite different stories that could be being told in 20 years' time, and we simply don't yet know which it is. Looking to history for other characters, I suppose one always compares Gordon Brown, because he so wanted to become Prime Minister, with what he wanted to be, and he clearly isn't a Gladstone or a Peel or a Thatcher or any major Prime Minister. But I suppose if you compare him with some of the other big characters in parties of the past, so you look back at the Liberal government of the earlier 20th century, and look at kind of Grey or Haldane, and say, those are huge statesmen, big characters who are pretty much forgotten now because they never got the top prize. And because he got the top prize, even though he isn't now seen as successful in it, we'll probably remember Gordon Brown more than we would have otherwise.
Well, you're listening to the LBC Book Club. Steve Richards is here. He's the author of Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour, that's published by Fourth Estate in paperback at $14.99. And Patrick Dillon, who's the author of The Story of Britain, published by Walker Books in hardback, delightful cover, at $18.99. And I would recommend... Obviously, I recommend both books, but I'm going to recommend Patrick's book, particularly as a Christmas present, for those people who you think don't really know enough about their history, but they ought to, and maybe they'd be interested in it. It is aimed at children, but I think anybody who wants to have a rudimentary understanding of the whole of British history, going back to 1066, could do far worse than look at Patrick's book. The time now is 9:45. Time for travel with Alan.
.co.uk/podcasts and listen again.
This is the LBC Book Club. I've got with me Patrick Dillon and Steve Richards. Steve, we're talking about his book, Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour. When you write a book like this, Steve, when you know that other people either have written or are writing a book at the same time, it's quite difficult to know how to pitch it, isn't it? Because I mean, Andrew Rawnsley was writing one, and Anthony Selden, we've had various others as well. How do you make sure that your book is different from the others?
Well, to be honest, I started from a slightly different point in a way of just thinking. I mean, I didn't say, I should write a book about this period. I thought there is a real gap in an area where I feel quite strongly, which is, as I say, a misunderstanding of what Brown in particular was about, and indeed those who worked with him in the Treasury. And so that's where I was starting. You mentioned Andrew Rawnsley. It's more a sort of narrative of the whole period, written more, I think he would say himself, from Tony Blair's perspective, and highly critical of Brown. I am critical too. It's an attempt to make a fair account, but in being fair, I think it does cast quite a lot of light on what they were trying to do. In some ways, things that were very interesting and were just sort of dismissed as, being all to do with the leadership or just fuming ambition. And it was much more complicated and in some ways noble than that, I think. They were big reformers, and it was so that's what I tried to do. But you're absolutely right. It is a very strange experience writing about people that you know, carrying on doing daily political journalism, and fully aware that about 25,000 of your colleagues are also writing books on the same period. But you've just got to do it in the belief that you have a distinct view of it, and hope it sort of permeates through with the other 25,000.
I can remember, and again with my publisher's hat on, that sort of my particular author in this was saying, we've got to get the book out before Steve Richards gets his out, and there's always this sort of, which we didn't do.
No, I was pleased about that.
There's always this, there is a real competition, isn't there, in this, and obviously sort of Andrew Rawnsley has all of his very gossipy anecdotes. Maybe I shouldn't say gossipy because it indicates that they're not true, but I mean, it's a very different style of writing to yours, isn't it?
It is, and I was, and it was, all credit to him. He got the stories about the bullying and stuff on the day of the launch, and it was this is trying to look at things through a very different perspective. Timing is also very interesting. I'm pleased that your colleagues didn't get their one out in front of me. I mean, Andrew decided to go before the election, and I just felt very uneasy about that because, in a way, I wanted the story to have an ending, and the ending was more interesting than many people expected with the hung Parliament.
Right, let's take a couple of texts. This is an anonymous one for Patrick. Does the story of Britain touch on slavery? If not, why not?
It does, so you don't need to worry about it. As we were talking about earlier, it seemed to me very important to make sure that we look at the dark sides as well as the good sides of our history, and I think that children are perfectly used to looking at difficult things now, and that's what they expect from the kind of fiction they read. So yes, we've got a chapter about slavery, as well as about the end of slavery. Yes, we look at Ireland. We look at quite a few. We look at some of what we did in India, for example. Not in a way that sets out to make us feel bad about ourselves or anything like that. Look, there are plenty of stories in our history that we can feel hugely proud of and should feel proud of. But I don't think it needs to be a story that leaves anything out, and slavery is absolutely part of that.
And a text for you, Steve. Paul wants to know, how did Brown retain his leadership with his particular flaws?
Well, it's an interesting question, and there is a theory that if they had dumped him, and there were 3 attempts to remove him, Labour might still be in power in some shape or form. It's not a theory I believe, actually. I've spoken to Peter Mandelson at length about this, because he was the one who could have removed him and didn't. And if I did a Radio 4 series... Sorry, are you allowed to mention Radio 4 and LBC?
Well, you just did.
I do apologise. I did a radio series in which I interviewed all these characters at the time the book went out, and he said, they were all very candid on the record actually, but he just said, if I thought it would help in any way, I would have removed him. But do you really believe that David Miliband would be carried into number 10, a crown upon his head, with Ed Balls paying homage and Ed Miliband serving sherry in celebratory mood? It would have been a bloodbath. In other words, there was no easy route for an alternative figure to descend from the skies and take over. And so I can understand entirely why they kept with him. And also, as we were talking earlier, he was performing heroics on the international stage in the midst of the economic crisis. So those are the reasons.
I think Paul's asked the wrong question, because I would ask the question, how did he get the leadership in the first place, when all of these Labour MPs knew exactly what he was like? They knew exactly what was going to happen, and yet they still voted for him because they were frightened of him, weren't they?
Some were, but not all. I mean, as a columnist, I remember writing at the time that this was a sensible move. I mean, they should have had a contest. I can't understand why that they were all so frightened of contests. But I thought at the time he was by far and away the most substantial candidate, and that if David Miliband had stood, who is a great, nice bloke and very experienced now with his various jobs, he would have been slaughtered. And not just on the grounds that they were frightened
by the great clunking fist.
No, I don't buy this thing. That if you look at all the people who were removed, in inverted commas, they all say it was Brown who destroyed them. But Charles Clarke, the Home Secretary, was in effect sacked by Tony Blair for issues in his department. Steve Byers resigned for issues in his department, etc., etc. He at the moment, because he's so unfashionable, gets blamed for everything. He's a deeply, deeply flawed figure, but there were some epic strengths in there as well.
I mean, I guess one of the key things that shines through your book, and indeed I think all books on this period, is the division between particularly Brown and Blair. But it was wider than that. It wasn't just those two personalities.
Absolutely.
And in a way, I think you make the point in some of your book, Patrick, that sort of division is at the heart of history, isn't it? That we carry old divisions into our current day politics.
And it's particularly at the heart of our history. I mean, one of the strengths of British history has been that for getting on for 400 years we've avoided violence. But that doesn't mean that we have a peaceful history. We have a history of dispute, of fragmentation, both over religion and over politics. And very many of those arguments you can see coming through now. It's always a quite interesting game I play with myself over politicians now to ask who would have voted to abolish slavery and who would have found the kind of pragmatic arguments to say it should stay. Yeah. And one can always play the game of who now is a cavalier and who's a roundhead, because you can nearly always come up with an answer for almost any politician. But more seriously, I mean, clearly, to understand where the parties are coming from now, why we have a coalition, why we have the system we have now, why the House of Lords is the way it is, why the government of Scotland is the way it is, and so on, you really have to go back to history, and we all, as citizens, as voters, as people who live in this country, just need to understand where those things come from. Partly to understand how strange our country is and how strange the political system we have is. For most of history, people would find it quite extraordinary that we make decisions in the way we do and yet live peacefully with them.
Just in the final few minutes, I want to turn to the teaching of history, because obviously this book is aimed at children, and also maybe touch on the teaching of politics in our schools, because I don't think either are taught very well at the moment, and the Coalition wants to change the way that history is taught. They've appointed Simon Sharma to do something or other, which I can't quite remember. How would you like to see history teaching change?
Well, I think the step they've taken is the first step they've taken. I completely support. One can throw too many stones at the national curriculum. My kids certainly loved hearing all about what it would be like to be a Victorian housemaid, and loved hearing about the Vikings. But it was alarming to discover that they didn't know which came first and which came second. And you can see how, for children, a history where you have sort of horn-headed warriors running into Victorian households and meeting men in periwigs, all mixed up in one thing, would be totally baffling, and therefore it's something they're not interested in. So I think it's essential to get back to chronology and narrative, which is exactly what Michael Gove is trying to do. However, I don't think that's the only answer. I was taught narrative history. We started with Julius Caesar every year, and the old teachers would get you to the Armada, and the trendy young ones would get you to the Battle of Britain, which was great. And then, like snakes and ladders, the next September, sort of Groundhog Day, you'd be back with Julius Caesar again. And not a lot of it was dates and battles. A lot of it was very dry. Not much of it stuck with me. I think what you need to ally to that chronology, that clear narrative, is stories, is getting children, young school-age, primary school-age children, just really enthralled by the situations, the people, the choices they faced, and just the great old stories that we all love, and that's the way to get them into it.
And just very briefly, Steve, in a sense, that's what politics is all about, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Stories.
I mean, I'm going to get Patrick's book, because stories and choices. You know, I sometimes go and talk to politics students and sixth formers, and, you know, just say, I can promise you politics is exciting. Don't buy this thing, because it's all about a never-ending episode of 24 with Jack Bauer when he's faced with a choice: do I kill my girlfriend or save America? You know, now politicians are faced with these nightmarish choices in history and today, and it is unavoidably exciting. It's a human drama, but crammed with ideas and unpredictability.
You just mentioned my favourite ever TV series there, 24, which I shall be spending most of Christmas watching, the last series, episode after episode. Well, thank you very much, Patrick and Steve, for coming into the studio. Whatever It Takes, The Real Story of Gordon Brown and New Labour by Steve Richards, and The Story of Britain by Patrick Dillon. Brilliant Christmas presents. Clive Bull is up next. This is LBC 96.